Today we have with us, I'll introduce our speakers in order of when they'll be speaking. Linda Hammond-Decker, who is of the Office of Justice Programs at the DOJ, followed by Erica Smith, who's at the Bureau of Justice at the DOJ, and Ms. Cindy Southworth of the National Network to End Domestic Violence. So, take it away. Linda, all yours.
Welcome, and thank you for coming. I'm going to start out by giving you just a very brief overview of human trafficking, what it is, and where it is today. Most of you probably remember from 4th or 5th grade when you had American history class, the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. And yes, my math is wrong. This was a slide that I used several years ago, so it's actually right now, as of 2015, it's 152 years, not 151. The intent of that document was to end slavery and set those people free, the ones that had been held as slaves and forced to work for the owners. Where are we today? We know that human trafficking is happening all around the world, and it's not just in other countries. It's not just in India, it's not just in Pakistan or China. It's happening here in the United States. We have very little, if any, very reliable data. We have some that we collect from our funded task forces, etc., but it's not what I consider to be totally reliable. And I'm sure Erica will touch on that when she does her presentation, because she's with the Bureau of Justice Statistics. We did, in January 1st of 2013, we added human trafficking to the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. But again, part of the problem there, the challenges that we're facing in adding that to the UCR is getting officers and agencies to properly code the incidents so that they're showing up as human trafficking. I'm actually not sure that President Lincoln would be very happy if he was here today. He's probably wagging his finger at us because human trafficking actually is modern-day slavery. There's no other way to put it. Do I have to hold it, or can I lay this down? Okay. What? Okay. A little too much technology here in front of me. We were already introduced, so I'm going to go right past this slide and go on to my next one. What is the federal response to human trafficking? In 2000, the very first comprehensive federal law was passed to protect victims of human trafficking and prosecute their traffickers. It's known as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and as with everything else in the federal government, has an acronym, TVPA, and that's what we recognize it as. And oftentimes you'll see that. It doesn't have anything to do with television and parent-teacher organizations. It's the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It's actually designed, the goals were to prevent trafficking overseas, to protect the victims and help them rebuild their lives, those that are in the U.S., also to prosecute the traffickers under very stiff federal penalties. It also authorized the Attorney General to make grants and provide funding to federal agencies, and that we can provide grants for funding services to combat trafficking. When I say combat trafficking, that's everything from conducting investigations, rescuing victims, to prosecuting the traffickers and providing services for the victims. The TVPA describes sex trafficking, and it's basically the same definition for sex and labor trafficking, as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of commercial sex acts or for labor or services. And I use the examples of garment factories, farm labor, and hotel cleaning services. The act is very specific that the traffickers must use the elements of force, fraud, and/or coercion, and that must be present in those cases. Many times, we're also finding that victims are drugged, or there's threats of violence against them or their families, either here in the United States or families back in other countries. Many times, the traffickers are seizing their immigration documents and withholding them, basically threatening, if you don't do this, we're going to have you deported. It didn't. Oh, see, I made it fancy and I forgot about it. Right. The state response to human trafficking, as of today, every state in the United States has an anti-human trafficking statute. Unfortunately, there are some that conflict with the federal law. Most of the conflict has to do with the issue of protection of minors. Under the federal law, if the person is under the age of 18, it's automatically a federal offense, and it's trafficking. Under some of the state laws, there's some variations to that. This chart shows that some of the states have excellent laws. Those are the ones that are in green. Some of them need some improvement. The two that are probably, as of the date, 2014 of this state rating, the two with the worst state laws are North Dakota and South Dakota. And I'm hopeful that they're working to change that, because there's been a huge increase in the number of trafficking incidents and trafficking in those two states because of the Bakken oil fields. And as of 2015, fiscal year 2015, and we just made those awards a month ago, the Office of Justice Programs, combination of the Office for Victims of Crime and Bureau of Justice Assistance, made an award of $1.5 million to the state of North Dakota Attorney General's Office to implement an enhanced collaborative model human trafficking task force. Again, better known as an ECM human trafficking task force. That includes, and the task force must include, local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, and victim service providers. They can't operate without having that collaboration. Just to give you an example of where trafficking is happening around the United States, and if you notice, the top item there is November 29th, 2015. That was 4 days ago, 5 days ago. And I pulled these yesterday. So this is, as of yesterday, that's the most current that I found. And they go down through 2015. The first 6 or 7 are from November. Some of those are at the bottom or later. But if you look at that, we're talking 9 different states on that list. It's happening not just in those 9 states, but in every state across the United States. It's happening in not just in large cities, not just in border states. It's happening everywhere. This is all I could put on one slide. And just to show you what's happening in our backyard, I don't know, anybody in here from Montgomery County, Maryland? Okay, so am I. Just so happens, we had this little local rag paper, the Gazette, and it's also online now. And these were 2 cases about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. One is in Dickerson, which is a very nice kind of rural community. And that's the one on the left where the housekeeper, and this was domestic servitude, it was not sex trafficking. And the other one is a Germantown woman was convicted of prostituting her daughter. Again, trafficking, because the daughter was under the age of 18. They're also, I live in a neighborhood in Germantown, Maryland. It's a single entrance neighborhood, not gated, but one street in and out. Houses sell for $500,000 and up. It's a very nice, safe community. We had human trafficking in my neighborhood. The home was owned by a foreign embassy. it was sex trafficking, and the trafficker was the son of one of the embassy diplomats. And it was interesting because this was about 2.5 years ago, and once it hit the newspaper, the neighbor whose property abuts where the house was sitting, kind of on a 90-degree angle, back to side, said, if I had any idea what human trafficking was, I guess I would have been more curious about all the girls on the back deck. There were witnesses, he didn't know what trafficking was. He just thought it was a party. Who are the traffickers? Well, we've already talked about the fact it could be the son of a foreign diplomat here on diplomatic immunity. They are people who take advantage of the vulnerable. They often recruit their victims with promises of a better life. We all want that. They're often hidden behind the guise of a legitimate business. We've had it in restaurants, massage parlors, fingernail poly, where you go to get your nails taken care of. They might be opportunistic individuals, organized crime and gangs. There's a definite correlation between gang activity and human trafficking. Business owners, as we said, diplomats, the mother or family members. We also talk about tribal, even though the tribal nations don't want to admit it. In some cases, it is the tribes themselves that are actually trafficking the women. It can be anyone. And who are the victims? Again, starting at the bottom, it can be anyone. Men, women, transgender individuals, adults, youth, and when I talk youth, I'm talking teenage bracket, but it can also be children, U.S. citizens, foreign nationals, some here with proper documentation, some that are here illegally, various educational and economic backgrounds. It can be anyone. The biggest, probably the vulnerability lies in the fact of that's the common denominator, is the victim's vulnerability. Whether it's because they're undocumented workers, they're runaway or homeless youth, individuals with substance abuse or addiction issues, low income. It's happening everywhere. They want to escape, but they don't have the chance to. It's happening here, it's happening all around the world. Now, to move into the topic of the role of technology in human trafficking. Many forms of technology are being used to commit the crime of trafficking. It's used to recruit, develop relationships, market the victims, but then it's also used on the backside to aid investigations, corroborate victim accounts, and also to prevent by raising public awareness. Some of the internet, a recent study by Thorne indicated that in minors recruited for sex trafficking over the last 4 years, most of them were more often than not recruited via the internet, using web pages such as Instagram, Facebook, Kik, and the newest being WhatsApp and Snapchat, but also Backpage is being used quite a bit to recruit and market youth trafficking victims. Cell phone technology is most often the prevalent form of technology used during the sex trafficking process. Communication between the trafficker and the buyer, with more than 60% reporting that they were contacted via phone calls, and the victims, 60+% via text messaging. And that's how the buyer communicates with the victim. Then also, technology is widely used to recruit foreign nationals Many times, cell phone technology doesn't work across country lines, but they're using the internet to recruit foreign nationals to come to the U.S. And again, not just for sex trafficking, but for labor trafficking, coming up from Colombia and some of your Central and South American countries to work in the fields in Florida and the Midwest, hotel and motel industry, in the summer months along the East Coast. I actually had a call back in June from a female from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, asking for assistance. There were 13 of them living in a 2-bedroom apartment. They were cleaning hotel rooms, and they basically had been told that if they left the apartment after hours at night, they would be reported and deported. And they were getting barely minimum wage to do the work. Most of their food was being brought into them. Obviously, I referred that down to the local police department and the U.S. Attorney's Office because we don't do our own investigations in our office. The really sad part is that 3 out of 4 of the underage sex trafficking victims said they had been advertised or sold online. That's 75%. So it's a huge, the technology and the use of the internet is big in this crime, in promoting it and expanding it. Now to get into the use of technology on the other side of the case to help investigate and prosecute, law enforcement investigators using social media and the internet to search for potential victims and traffickers through ads placed on websites such as Backpage. And I actually, as I was preparing to do this presentation, for the first time actually went out and Googled Backpage. I mean, I have no reason to go there, but I Googled it just to see. And on that previous slide where the list was, there's actually a list of states, countries, and you click on the area you want, and the ads come up. The bad part is that I was working through a federal government connection, and it shut me down. So I had to shut everything down and go back. It caught me. So I'm probably going to get called to the Human Resources Office, and they're going to want to know what I was doing on Backpage. Some of the types of technology used during investigations are still the old surveillance cameras, GPS tracking devices, and a new technology. I'm a former law enforcement officer, so those were familiar with me, but when we start talking about UFEDs, I thought, what is that? It's a universal forensic extraction device. It's actually used to extract data and information off of computers and cell phones. They're also still using wiretaps, same basic technology that we were using 30 years ago, but it still works. They're using that to uncover financial footprints using the green dot cards. And now I also understand there's some called blue dot cards. The debit cards that can be recharged and have money put on. The traffickers are using those a lot. All of this technology helps them observe and record the trafficking operations. I want to do a quick case study for you from Cook County State's Attorney's Office in Illinois. They are one of our BJA-funded Enhanced Collaborative Model Task Forces. As a matter of fact, they just, within the last couple of days, received an award from the, from the Cook County Crime Stoppers organization for the work that they are doing on human trafficking and some of the prosecutions. They're one of our better task forces. They're very active. This particular case started in November of 2009. It actually started with a very early collaboration, which is difficult sometimes to grasp, between the law enforcement agency and the state's attorney, because the police department actually contacted the state's attorney and said, hey, we think you need to get involved in this early on. Way too often law enforcement waits until they've gotten to the point where they're ready to charge, and then sometimes the cases aren't prosecutable because they don't have all the data and information they need. So they started early. That collaboration began in about January 2010. The investigation spanned 18 months. There was extensive use of technology, and the takedown was in August of 2011. So it went on for a little over 18 months. The technology was used to gather evidence. They used poll cameras and surveillance vans with video cameras. They used GPS tracking devices to enhance the physical surveillance. They used the wiretapping, and it's difficult to kind of grasp that when you think of today's modern technology, that they would still use it. But it's still reliable, and it's still valuable information that can be collected using the wiretaps. They actually conducted 4 court-authorized electronic surveillance orders, tapping phones belonging to 3 different targets over a 3-month period. They included real-time interception of text messages on cell phones and phone calls between the traffickers. And in some of those conversations, they actually discussed pimp rules, pimp partners, girls, money, cars. They actually were able to hear the traffickers manipulate the victims with seduction and deception, various forms of coercion, and threats of violence to some of them. All of that served to corroborate the actual testimony and taken during the interviews of the victims. And the results were, they called it Operation Little Girl Lost. You can see that there were actually, they classified it as a criminal enterprise. It included acts of involuntary sexual servitude of a minor. There were 10 persons arrested and charged. All of those 10 pleaded guilty. And the combined total of time in prison was 102 years. But without the use of the technology to collect the evidence, they probably would have only been able to charge 3 or 4 of them. All of them actually pled guilty because of the scope of the surveillance and the collected information via the wiretaps. The best outcome of this is not that the good thing is we put 10 people in prison for 102 years, but the best outcome is 76 females who were being victimized by those persons, 30 of them were minors, were rescued and received services. None of the victims had to testify or confront their traffickers in court because they all pled guilty. Proof of the value of the evidence was the one person there, Jarrell Creekmore. He actually he agreed to a 20-year sentence in a plea deal that was recommended by his defense lawyers. That's how convincing the evidence was. And some thoughts for the future. Things that we can do in the future to further working towards combating human trafficking. From a policy perspective, the use of technology does play a critical role both in the perpetration of the crime as well as the identification of the victims, the investigation of the crimes, and the prosecution of the cases. I consulted with several of our task force subject matter experts, and we kind of came up with this list together. We're of the mindset that the agencies responsible for the technology share some degree of culpability in how their products are being used to exploit and victimize people. With this in mind, I'm suggesting the following: that we ensure that technology tools stay current, that they're most effective, user-centric, and respond to the changing technologies and the changes in trafficking. and how the traffickers are using technology. We look to enhance cooperation to combat human trafficking across government, non-government, and private sectors to share information. This is critical to working towards preventing it and combating those incidents that do happen. That we increase major tech firm obligations and encourage the development of anti-trafficking initiatives. And this could be through private sectors recognizing that their services and networks, number one, they have to recognize that they're being used to exploit minors, to exploit people, and by the traffickers to commit this crime. And that they take initiatives through their technologies and policies and the development of anti-trafficking technology that could help to combat it. That we develop improved data collection to document the evidence of human trafficking. And again, that's difficult because that's not always totally technology-based. There are people, even though technology plays a key role in gathering information, there are still people that are in the middle of that. And Eric and I were talking earlier about how things are entered, the call comes in, it's coded as a certain type of call, a certain crime, but then as it goes through the investigation process, it might have been called in as a case of prostitution or a prostitute working the street. But by the time the investigation is over, they've actually turned it into a human trafficking investigation. But it takes a person to sit down and recode that in the database. So part of the problem is the challenge is getting through to law enforcement, to the data analysts, and we need to do increased awareness and training of law enforcement and the people who are tracking it. Provide grant opportunities for research. Again, through some of the funding we get, and we're not, the Office of Justice Programs isn't the only federal agency that has funding, grant funding to combat human trafficking. Health and Human Services, Department of Labor, just about every agency does. It's just a case of, we have a collaborative group that meets once a quarter, but it's a case of getting us all on the same page to work at some of these issues that were coming up, these brick walls that we're hitting. The grants for research would be on the impact that technology is having on trafficking. We really don't know. We know that it's having an impact, but we don't know to what degree. The best practices in the use of technology to prevent, identify, investigate, and prosecute. Cook County is a good example, but is that a best practice? Does it work for everyone? Not everyone is Cook County and has the resources and the connections between the prosecutors. A lot of the prosecutors, a lot of prosecutorial agencies in smaller jurisdictions don't have the knowledge of human trafficking. And they're going to look at law enforcement and say, you're talking about what? We don't know what you're talking about. You mean bringing illegal immigrants into the country? No, that's not what we're talking about. But it's difficult getting them to connect. Also, perhaps one of my SMEs said perhaps expanding the development of algorithms to identify ongoing violations, for example, through text, apps on the phone, and also images. Implement policies and protocols to streamline federal and local law enforcement access to information. I've been there. I know what it's like to try to get a search warrant. And that was just a simple search warrant back many years ago to go into a building and search for evidence. It's even more complicated now when you start talking about searching computers, devices, the internet, apps. There's just a lot of disconnect. It would be for looking for data files, user information, images, use history of suspected human trafficking accounts on servers and cloud technology. Now, I think of, again, I'm law enforcement. I'm not a techie geek. I think of clouds as those things that float around in the sky. But they keep telling me that we're putting data in our office on clouds. I haven't found it yet. And lastly, to promote the increased use of technology to raise awareness, not only of law enforcement, but also the general public, code enforcement agencies, because they're out there in the public, they see things, health inspectors in your restaurant, your hotels, motels, they may see something, but if they don't know what they're seeing, they're not going to be able to report it. We're working, my agency, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, is working to expand training for law enforcement and encourage them to use available resources to increase public awareness in their jurisdictions. And I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm going to, is there, if I can. Oh, here we go. Am I good or what? We have no volume though. Uh-oh, hold on. Wait a minute. Yeah. Okay, this is, and this was not done by my agency, this was done by Department of Homeland Security, Blue Campaign. And this basically is a public awareness campaign that shows the fact that, oh, maybe we will be able to hear it.
Might be.
Aha. This, hold on, this is not the same one.
You're gonna wanna go back one, just up and back.
The mouse is hard to use.
Aha, I see. It is a little difficult.
Could launch it again.
Go back, here we go.
Every day we go about our lives driven by routine and blindfolded to the realities.
Can you hear it?
Yes, thank you.
Our vision is clouded by the very normalcy we take for granted. Countless victims of human trafficking walk among us, seemingly invisible. Until now. The Blue Campaign provides a unified voice for those who oppose the heinous crime of human trafficking. Whether it's forced labor, domestic servitude, or the sex trade, it's time we open our eyes.
Sorry, I didn't even see you.
Learn what you can do to help by visiting dhs.gov/bluecampaign.
Yeah, and we actually, we have 10 new human trafficking task forces that the Bureau of Justice Assistance just provided funding to. 4 of them are statewide, North Dakota, whoops, this is another one, but we'll turn. You can find these on YouTube. And we're actually going to have them use these. There's no point in making new videos. They're here. We're going to have them connect with their local public broadcast agencies to run these in their areas. Now, some of them are just county agencies. Jefferson Parish, Louisiana got a grant. Michigan State Police in the Detroit and Wayne County area are going to be doing it. But we're going to require them to use some of these commercials publicly to alert people to what's going on in their areas. Do you have any questions?
Yes. Do you run training and exercises to teach people about how to recognize this stuff?
We are working on it. I came into human trafficking at BJA about a year and a half ago, and obviously it was a new topic to me. I knew it existed, but it wasn't something I had ever dealt with in law enforcement back when I was on the street. We, for some years, have had an advanced investigators training for law enforcement. We also have an online human trafficking 101 type training for law enforcement. We also had a prosecutor's training and a training for judges to orient them to what human trafficking really is. We now have a new training and technical assistance provider, the International Association of Chiefs of Police. We don't want to create training that's already available, so their task initially is to go out and assess what training's available and kind of compile a list. And then we're also going to look at the value to trafficking task forces.
So let's say I work with a group of area labs and I handle the back office, the video enterprise for law enforcement vehicles, and also work with a international inspection system for border report, where you see people in vehicles. If I have access to all those technologies, since I'm an entrepreneur and I've developed these cloud capabilities and I've given to Amazon for logistics and supply, is there a place where I could get those companies to donate? Would they be interested in donation of innovation? Is there a, like in this, in Fort Pickett, I have the state police over a 17-mile restricted flight space, so I see you using that environment. In fact, I'm talking to Congress, I'm talking to the governor of Virginia. I had $9 million to upgrade Fort Pickett because the state police were there, and I had a lot of other groups there, and now I'm come full circle. But because I'm always believing that it is a technology issue, but then with the technology comes this coordination, cooperation, collaboration piece, which I've always been this way, horizontal.
Mhm.
But most people are very vertical. And until you break out of that vertical mindset, because it's the people in the field that have to recognize, detect, and respond. And so the question is, how do you involve those other people who could be the people telling you?
It might make sense just for time to
Yeah,
go
what?
through the other two presentations.
Yeah,
and then
let's do
we
that,
have
yeah.
a full discussion.
Yeah, that's fine. And I'm going to turn it over to Erica.
Well, we're gonna be bookended by probably the more sort of personal side to the story. I'm gonna be a little less personal and more analytic. So hopefully that doesn't translate to boring, but we'll find out.
Yeah, you might want to move the mic over too.
Oh, thank you. So I put
Do you want to move over?
No, it's fine. Hopefully, it'll be fine. I put slides together. Hopefully, I don't become a slave to them. But just a few things to kind of talk a bit about the challenges and considerations for collecting better data. We basically don't have really good incidence and prevalence counts of human trafficking. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is and some of the challenges to improving the data, and then what our goals for actually making those data improvements would really be, and how that can drive what changes we might make in the future, or could consider making anyway. So, I'm going to turn my page here. So as Linda had mentioned, we've got the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was passed originally in 2000 and then re-upped in 2008, which added to the TVPA a requirement that the FBI begin collecting these data on human trafficking at both the offense level, so at the basic incident level, and then at the arrest level. And it required the FBI to not only collect these data, but to make distinctions between different types of trafficking offenses and arrest offenses within that definition from the original TVPA of severe forms of trafficking in persons. So while the legislation passed in 2008 that had this requirement for the FBI, it did take a number of years to go through sort of the typical FBI process for adding these elements to the Uniform Crime Reporting Program, and working with state crime reporting agencies and local agencies to determine how best to implement the change. So the first year that data was collected was in 2013. And data were collected in two additional categories for both the offense and the arrest data. First was human trafficking and commercial sex acts, and then the other is human trafficking and involuntary servitude. And these definitions are right on the FBI website for anyone to be able to take a look at. They also have they tried to provide some uniform definitions to agencies, but as we'll talk about a little bit more, and as Linda had already alluded to a number of times in her presentation, the operationalization of that at the local level is really the most important aspect of collecting good data, and we're not really seeing that just yet. So while a lot of outreach was conducted at both the state crime reporting level and then down to the local agency level, what we're going to see in this next slide about the actual data being reported from 2013 is that we have a really long way to go to get better data at the national level. So this is the number of states that have reported human trafficking data to the UCR program as of 2013. The 2014 data are not available yet, but hopefully should be maybe early next year, just given how data flow into the UCR program in general. It usually is about a year lag or so for the data. So as you can see, the total number of states submitting is pretty low. That's the actual full table. I didn't get rid of anything. And it's missing the biggest and most populous states in the country. So no California, no Florida, no New York, no Texas. And it's missing most of the states on the southwest border. So state program managers have expressed that collecting these data from law enforcement agencies is pretty difficult, and agencies tell the state program managers that they don't have any cases of human trafficking, so that's why they didn't report anything. Is that believable from either side of the equation? Right, right. And what might cause officers and law enforcement agencies to believe that they don't have to deal with human trafficking? I mean, if we start at the top and we see the total number of states submitting data is 13, and the estimated number of law enforcement agencies within those 13 states is that 3,700 number that's up there on the slide, we can see that that is a woefully inadequate estimate just based on the fact that there are about 18,000 local law enforcement, state, local, and sheriff's agencies in the United States. So we really have a lot of undercoverage. So let's go back to that question about, why is it that officers might think, well, I don't really deal with human trafficking, so, what's the problem? So what are some of the challenges in collecting the data generally? So we've got some definitional issues. That's probably not the crux of the problem, but it does have something to do with it. You're going to have some state statutes that are going to be designating certain categories as human trafficking. You're going to have state statutes for prostitution and for pornography and other types of sex crimes and commercial sex act crimes that are going to overlap with the definitions of human trafficking. And because those are more typical street crime type of issues that police deal with, they may get categorized that way as opposed to human trafficking. We also have this issue of being able to benchmark and to perform some type of risk assessment for how often human trafficking is actually occurring. There was some work done through a grant from the National Institute of Justice by Sheldon Zhang at the San Diego State University. He was looking into some of these particular issues when it came to both sex trafficking and labor trafficking in San Diego, in the San Diego region. And his point, and I think every researcher and epidemiologist would probably agree, population estimates are vital for gauging the magnitude of any social problem. And without being to gauge the magnitude of this problem, we really have no way to market outward why this is something federal dollars should be put forward toward, why agencies should pay a lot more attention to it than they already do, and why any practices on a wide-ranging basis within state and local law enforcement agencies should actually be changed to try to combat it differently. The reasons that he laid out for the difficulty in determining these rates are a lack of systematic information about the existence of a victim pool, which is a strange way of thinking about it, but a victim pool in areas where human trafficking activities are known to exist, and then also back to basic detection issues and inadequate capacities for identifying victims and then tracking them forward. This then brings us to what happens when when a law enforcement agency actually finds out about an offense that could be considered to be human trafficking. So law enforcement agencies record incident information typically, not always, but typically via a record management system. That record management system is used by the record management system, I should say, that is used by an agency can impact the ability within that agency to code or detect human trafficking cases. I have a number of reasons why I believe that this is the case. So the first has to do with initial intake considerations. This is something that Linda actually already talked about in her presentation, that officers may not record these incidents as human trafficking in their initial case reports. It's prostitution, and it moves forward that way. The second issue has to do with the ability to update case information as an investigation moves forward. So those incidents that weren't discovered to be incidents of human trafficking until further investigation is conducted, the change in the system, the change may never be made in the initial incident system where those records are pulled from. Maybe change somewhere else down the road in a totally different system, and the connection is not made at an aggregate data level. The third reason that the record management system may actually have an impact, the technology itself may have an impact on these numbers, is that there's inadequate tracking of cases over time through the investigative process. RMS may record initial case information, but the system might not follow the life of the case. So a good example of this is right now, currently in the New York City Police Department. Officers go out with a form. It's a 4-page, humongous form. It's like 8.5 by 14, as I recall. And they code all this information, they bring it back, and it's all done by hand, and they bring it back to a precinct, and they put it in a pile, and a data entry clerk enters that information. So it's specialized in terms of the process for getting the information in the system. But then later on down the road, anything that is followed up by a detective goes in a different system. And they're linked theoretically by a case number, but the linkage in one data system is never made. Anything that happens on the arrest side is a third separate system. Injuries to victims are in a fourth system, and someone has to make all those record linkages. It sounds like a simple problem to fix, but when you have 38,000 police officers and over 1 million arrests, I want to say it's like 1 million arrests a month or something like that. It's an astronomical number. No one's really making those connections outside of being able to respond to the mayor's office or the governor's office on those types of issues. The fourth issue that I've identified here is pattern detection across cases. Investigators may have incomplete information, which hinders their ability to link incidents or cases together, which is then only exacerbated by these data and technology issues. And the fifth and sixth reasons are actually really interrelated. The age of the record management system and the ability of that system to adapt to changes in the required elements is really difficult. So older RMS might not have adequate capabilities to adapt to new offense types. They may not link to other systems to be able to look for these patterns. And changes to legacy systems can be cost prohibitive for an agency, right? Well, maybe, we have to talk about that. And in terms of the adaptability, the most important thing about the adaptability is that the details of the contract that is made with the RMS service provider can actually be the number one thing that dictates whether a system can be changed or not. Because if at the time of the purchase you didn't specify that you want to have that adaptability, or you didn't specify how those changes might be made, it has a major impact on a law enforcement agency's ability to work with their record management system and the vendor who's providing that information to make those changes and to extract information. This is less of a problem in our experience at BJS. It's less of a problem in larger agencies than in smaller agencies. But I can't say that systematically. And the world is definitely changing. So we are making forward momentum on that for sure. I know, we'll get to it.
Fairfax County, how they like those ordinance changes in there.
I'm sure. And that is a big agency, right?
No, it was a workflow, and it took 3 times longer for law enforcement to have a ticket. He gave me, I was speaking, let me go, because I told him.
Because it took too long to get to it?
No, he ended up letting me, he was just venting that no one asked the law enforcement people what they saw as something.
Yeah.
They made it much more, and you make it more
Right. So all the training in the world may not actually
If you don't get the
change
word
much
go,
if you,
it
right,
won't make it simple.
right.
Which unfortunately most of the big boards don't make things simple.
Right. Well, let me kind of go through the rest of this a little bit more quickly so that we have, we give Cindy adequate time, because I think you're going to probably be more compelling than this for sure. But so another issue that impacts the type of data that we get from law enforcement agencies on human trafficking incidents is determining who the responsible party is, who's taking ownership over the case. Linda had talked about the funding of human trafficking task forces. And while a multidisciplinary approach to many of these hidden types of offenses is key to really bringing attention to the issues and allowing the, greater detection, the task forces actually complicate the issue of who has responsibility for recording the information. So in terms of the task forces, there's often a federal actor, and you often need a hook to figure out who ends up being prosecuted by a U.S. attorney as opposed to a local prosecutor. Local prosecutor. And data from these task forces are often not included in local crime data counts. The number of special jurisdiction law enforcement agencies in the country is about 3,000, and a number of those are task forces, at least within the titles that they provide on those actual agency names. It's not specifically a uniform issue. It's not clear within and across states if task force data are included in local crime counts or not, but we suspect that they're, on the whole, not being subsumed by the local agencies that are participating. And then the other issue has to do with local law enforcement agencies not recording these human trafficking offenses in their RMS at all. So even if they are participating, none of that information is being attributed to workload going on at the local level. So with all that being said, how could we improve data on human trafficking? Practice makes perfect. This is the whole issue of training and reiterative process to the training, and to making people in the community aware of these types of offenses, and then promoting that within law enforcement circles as well. I also believe that it's really a requirement to supplement data from law enforcement agencies with information from victim service providers, federal prosecutors and state prosecutors, who are likely going to be the ones who are going to determine a pattern across a large number of cases more readily in some in probably suburban and rural areas than the local law enforcement agencies will. And then the last slide here that I have just deals with some questions that I think still need to be answered a little bit more clearly for a federal agency to be able to understand how to make an impact on the quality and quantity, quite frankly, of data collected on this topic. It's this issue of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You know, what is the gold standard of data on human trafficking, and why? What would be the goals of collecting data a certain specific way? And then can you try to achieve those goals through other methods of data collection? It may be that you would want to have individual level data and be able to track that over time and be able to connect those individual people, but the cost and the difficulty in being able to do that outside of how much that might cost may prohibit you. Are there other ways that we can do this, looking within jurisdictions and aggregating up in different ways? And then would improvements in training for the detection and response to human trafficking offenses actually help reach those goals? So that's all I have. And I'm going to turn it over to Cindy now.
Can you do me a favor, just press B on the keyboard and it should go to black? Perfect, thanks. I'm going to sort of be brief. I wanted to not do a PowerPoint so that I could sort of ebb and flow and not duplicate content they'd already covered. And since Linda and Erica gave you a real background on sort of what is trafficking, how it's playing out, what numbers and what funding are out there, what I want to do instead is talk a bit about what we're seeing on the ground around technology. And to start off, I founded our Safety Net Technology Project 15 years ago, and it looks at all forms of violence against women, so domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, dating abuse, trafficking, and the intersection of technology. And our project is nested at the National Network to End Domestic Violence, but we are not limited to domestic violence. We're a much broader project than that. And just my background, I grew up with an extremely techie father to where we had motherboards on the kitchen table and memory on the stairs. And my dad desperately wanted his daughters to go into the tech field, and I got my master's in social work and have been working on social justice issues for the past 25 years, and my sister's all but dissertation in Spanish literature. So, but what ended up happening is I was the one always fixing the computers at the local shelter and helping install email at the local rape crisis center, and so I sort of fell into this nexus of addressing technology and violence against women. The National Network to End Domestic Violence in the U.S. is an umbrella organization, and we support the 56 state and territory coalitions. They're all nonprofits. There's one at every state capital, and then they support, sort of as an umbrella, the 2,000 plus local programs around the U.S., the shelters, advocacy centers. And the reason I brought our reports with me, and if you didn't get one, please feel free to take some, is we actually we do a one-day snapshot count every year, and it's intentionally not invasive. We actually don't go up and talk to victims as part of this count. We don't want to be one more person in a victim's face saying, I'm sorry you're running for your life, but could you just take a few minutes to answer some questions for me? So instead, we ask the advocates to tell us what's happening on the ground in one snapshot. And one of the things that we find consistently every year is that local domestic violence programs are actually providing an incredible amount of services to trafficking victims. 70% of local programs, it fluctuates between 69 to 71% of local programs in a given year are serving trafficking victims. We dug into that number one year, and we actually asked how many are sheltering trafficking victims, and it's basically 18%. Transitional housing, it was 4%, and there's not enough transitional housing for any victims, especially counseling, 15%, advocacy with law enforcement, 14%, working with ICE, 9%, and then working with attorneys, 9%, and then other 4%. So essentially, local domestic violence programs are filling this sort of gap in a lot of rural communities. They end up doing domestic violence, sexual assault, all crime victims, trafficking. Pretty much having worked in local Maine and rural Pennsylvania, you pretty much do what needs to get done for any victim of any crime. So I've got that. The other piece that I want to talk about in terms of tech misuse is, as Linda said, there's apps, there's phones, there's all sorts of things out there that are being used to really market and sell people to perform acts, whether it be labor acts or sex acts. And then there's also the technology for good. So there's an app out there called Safe Night that one of my coworkers is an advisor on, and it helps broker get donors to give money when someone needs shelter for trafficking victims. And they're doing it, it's TechSoup, which is a group that does a lot of great nonprofit technology work. So there's those things. And then PhotoDNA, which is something that the Microsoft folks came up with and is now being widely used by all technology companies. And it basically can identify exploitative images of children, child pornography. And it creates a hash function based on the image. And no matter where that photo shows up again, it will be tracked. So even if they change the color of the bedspread, if they crop it in, it has a unique hash to it so that that image can be tracked and those photos can be pulled off Facebook, off Google, off YouTube. It unfortunately doesn't mean that every offender is apprehended and every victim is protected, but we're at least minimizing the impact of the photos that are being put out there. I think there's several challenges that, in terms of trafficking, that for me feel very familiar. And having been doing this work for 25 years, one of the things that I think is complicated is that trafficking coexists as part of domestic violence when you look at mail order brides. So 20-some years ago, I worked with a victim who was sleeping in the woods with her German Shepherd. She was originally from Poland, and her husband had said, if you leave me, and she was a mail order bride, if you leave me, they're going to deport you. And if you leave me, I'll kill the dog. And if you leave me, I'll take your papers. I mean, very, very common trafficking situation and immigration and domestic violence. But we have a hard enough time getting police to name that as domestic violence, much less to name it trafficking. So these are very complicated issues. And in her case, she finally found us, and we got her to safety, and she was able to bring her dog with her. But it was just heartbreaking. And then when you look at child sexual assault, and then you find youth on the streets because they've been sexually assaulted by their caregivers at home, they're now on the street and they're now being trafficked by others to perform sex acts. Is that sexual assault? Is that prostitution? Or is that trafficking? Or is it D, all the above? But a lot of the computer systems were not created to let you check multiple boxes. It's one crime only. And so which one do you pick? And then you also get into really bad data collection. My favorite that I heard was a pilot project where people were on the streets advocates and volunteers and others, and they do this with homeless people. They go up to homeless men under bridges who sometimes are distrustful of the government and ask them their name, their date of birth, their social number, and other invasive information. And it doesn't always go so well, as one can imagine. So they decided this is a great solution. Let's try it with teens. And they went up to youth on the street, homeless youth, and asked them their sexual orientation. Are you LGBT? Are you a victim of child sexual assault? On the street in front of their peers. Brilliant. And understandably, the teens were a little uncomfortable answering about their gender orientation and sexual orientation in front of large crowds. I was just like, really? Step away from the survivor and leave the movement now. Like, pretty much get a new career because you should not be working with human people. I have strong opinions on bad practice. So you have those dilemmas of how do you get good data when there's these complex issues that go into it. One of the other issues that I see all the time in terms of complexities is competing jurisdiction issues. And so trafficking lends itself often to be handled at the federal level, but our federal law enforcement have been very heavily focused on homeland security, and meaning homeland from far away, not homeland in your home. And so we have a very difficult time getting the feds to take on any cyber stalking case, any sexual assault case, or any domestic violence case, even when everything fits. It's crossed state lines, there's been interstate stalking. And so I'm sort of bemused that we have any federal trafficking prosecutions. I'm like, woohoo! You know, I've seen 2 federal stalking cases in my 15 years. So, you know, it's a long haul. It's a long road, but there is a definite commitment to it, and we're seeing movement. But it takes a long time. The domestic violence and sexual assault movement have been organized for 40 years in the U.S., and we're finally getting good statistics. So the fact that we're struggling with trafficking data doesn't surprise me. For me, it just feels like the natural progression of once we identify the issues, then we have to get to good definitions, then we have to train the hell out of everybody, and then retrain them, because the good people get promoted and they go elsewhere, and then you have to train the new crop of officers and victim advocates coming in. In terms of policy issues, there's additional policy loopholes that are out there, and what I find really interesting when you look at prosecuting other forms of violence against women is don't just go for trafficking, don't just go for stalking, is throw the book at the offenders. And so right now with cyber stalking and domestic violence, it is illegal to wiretap your partner. If you intercept electronic communications, it's illegal, but it is not illegal to intercept the location of your partner. There's a location loophole. So Senator Franken has proposed a bill, the Location Privacy Protection Act, that would make it illegal federally to track the location of someone surreptitiously, just like it's illegal to track their communications, wiretap, without a warrant. And so there's things like that that can be looked at and then brought into play. One of the other dilemmas we're seeing with tech is that trafficking victims are often given phones to be used as a way to essentially manage the sex acts so that they can communicate with their John. Those phones are being compromised, spyware is put on them. So if the victim texts the National Trafficking Helpline, that text is going to be read by her offenders and perpetrators. And so we do a lot of training on spyware, and essentially if you suspect that your phone is compromised, it is. I actually have a huge foam board that I've shown of all the spyware on the market. And it's cheap, it's affordable, it's easy to install. And so one of the reasons we have webcam covers is to make sure that your cameras are never turned on without your choice, because spyware can turn on a camera remotely. So I keep my phone's camera covered at all times. And if I want to take a photo, I just move the cling. It's not a sticker, so it doesn't make it goopy. And then you just put it back when you're done with your FaceTime with your grandmother, which I do with my 91-year-old grandmother all the time. So that is a bit on the technology components. We could talk more, but I want us to respect there is another group coming in at 3:30, so that'll give us a little bit of, nope. So we can chat a bunch a little bit and have some conversations and take it from there. I would love to know who's in the room. Since we don't have a very big group, I'd love to go around and just quickly say who, your name, what entity you represent, or what hat you're wearing. Like, you're a student, or you're a professor, or you a policy wonk. Would you mind starting?
Sure. So my name is Taylor Mack. I just recently graduated from the College of Engineering in 2015. I majored in government and sociology. I coming to this conference because my girlfriend is a biology major and is interested in environmental conservation. But because of my sociology major, very comprehensive intersectional focus, and I think the issues of domestic violence is also something I'm interested in, so that's why I came specifically to
Fabulous.
this lecture.
Great, thanks. Want to go to the back?
I'm Patrick Harshon. I was actually invited by Carol Walker. So, I presently work at the Pentagon. I'm a senior military analyst, and for Marine Corps Solutions Command for the entire Marine Corps. So we do policy focused more on the logistics side of the military for the Marine Corps. But I wasn't, before that, I retired from the military, and I was in emergency operations. So I worked with the CIS and FBI and local law enforcement. So, but my interest here is just, it's piquing my interest, and I actually have grand jury duty presently, and so I can't discuss the cases,
Of
but
course.
just hearing this information is interesting, and kind of relates to a lot of things that I've heard so far as I've been going cases.
I'm glad you're here.
My name is Thomas Woodson. I'm a professor at Stony Brook University. My department is called Technology and Society. I do a lot with innovation policy, really how's technology for people in developing countries. So it's a little different than my research area, but still kind of into technology policy.
Cool.
I'm Cheryl. I work at PSO, so I'm here, but I'm also very interested in this particular topic, and I think I reached out to all three of you purposefully, so.
I'm Megan Netterbean. I just actually moved up here in August from Houston, Texas, where I did volunteer work for the Human Rights Coalition and manned a few hotlines at 4 in the morning. So hearing some of your meeting to be on the ground was actually kind of made me feel like it's not nearly as bad. It does help. But I am an events management contractor.
Great.
Hi everyone, my name is Denise Cruz. I work for a company called Tech Shop. It's a do-it-yourself makerspace. One of my colleagues is actually speaking at the conference today, and I'm here to support him, but I was very interested in this particular topic, so that's why I came. And thank you.
Thanks. And you?
Yes, I'm Joel Coulter. I am an entrepreneur, Chuck Manto, and I was part of StarTide, so I was forward deploying advanced security surveillance technologies for peace building, stability, do eco villages, but I also work with Cybernaut. I was the guy that developed the wearable technologies for law enforcement. So I'm on my hope here. So what I'm doing now is I know Ariane Labs, and I know about the Microsoft Video Enterprise for law enforcement vehicles. I am actually talking to Ariane Labs on Wednesday, because the company I lead recently, a group called KSI Video, is specifically focused on law enforcement with the use of small UFs. So but I'm a collaborative technology guy. I group systems for IBM back in the early, I'm an old guy. But I've watched how difficult it is to compare when we've centralized something like the FBI to get the real responsibility to the field where it needs to be. Because you have to share that data. If you don't, there is no response. And so we all struggle in this country, unlike other countries, they don't have the struggle because they're not as
They have different struggles.
well, but they're not as stovepipe.
Yeah, it cracks me up in international work that I do, that in the US, we're terrified about government having access to our information, but we'll hand it all over to Facebook. Internationally, it's the flip. They'll give everything to government, but they're terrified of corporate America or corporations having your information. So it's really fun to watch how cultural differences play out around data privacy and comfort. Yep. Yeah. One thing I didn't mention that we do beyond our technology around helping develop apps, we're actually creating an app right now with Office of Victims of Crime money on technology and safety planning, and it'll be for trafficking victims, sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking victims. And we have to actually keep the amount of information we put in the app minimal, because we don't want to have a training tool for offenders. You know, how do I stalk better? How do I monitor better? So we're dancing that line. And then we also advise tech companies. So I sit on the Facebook Safety Advisory Board. I advise Twitter. I was actually meeting with Uber and Airbnb this week because I'm on their safety advisory board. So we do a lot of work with technology folks.
So one of the things I'll listen, I'm an innovation person, so I'm starting to see a lot of barriers to change within the federal government. So I'm trying to get states and locals to, like Griffiths Air Force Base or Fort Pickett, where I have a state police, where we can show people the art of the possible to inspire them to evolve their workflows and change, because it'll be years, as you said, and we don't have years. I don't know when they did the hidden camera thing around the world, and the Department of Justice publishes a book on every country's role and where they are in sex trafficking, which You have got to start using the web like the people who traffic these people use it, to shame them. You really got to go to the shame model. If you don't, you'll never catch it. You'll never catch it.
What other questions? Yes, Taylor.
Yeah, so I had two questions. One, I really appreciated that all three of you all touched on how at different phases of a case, it can change, and like, especially the direction that a prosecutor might want to take it, in terms of, okay, we have this one person who we caught on the streets who seems to be involved in prostitution and things of that nature. So there's a certain code for that. But then if they were able to, without any sort of time constraints or budget constraints, to kind of look at it more comprehensively, they would probably identify it as more connected to like human trafficking issues and things like that. And so since technology plays like such a key part in connecting the survivor to the perpetrator and things of that nature, how can we improve or kind of like intervene so that the survivors of these heinous crimes don't get caught up in any sort of like self-incrimination where it's like, oh, well, the phone that you're using, like you've been corresponding and you've given your, I don't know, it's not consent, but you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like, oh, we can see that like you've done certain acts in this crime.
For me, the easy answer to that is we need to decriminalize being a victim.
Yeah.
Period. Because the minute it's a crime to be performing a sex act, your victims of sex trafficking are not going to come forward. They can't risk coming forward, and so that's an easy one. So that make sure that they have immunity no matter what. There's still logistical issues of often if one victim goes forward, there's still someone back that is at risk. And so if you tell your sister's going to be killed, if you tell I will, whatever. So it is more complicated than just reaching out and helping one individual victim. Breaking a ring open is mighty complicated, but an easy way is to make sure that we don't make it a crime to be a victim.
Yeah, and then my other question was kind of related to the preventative nature of this. So also like before the perpetrator gets apprehended as well as once they do get apprehended, is there sort of like a place within the movement to kind of like set up structures in terms of like rehabilitation or treatment or like, and then also like how is technology being used to kind of prevent pre and post?
And I think your question there is really exciting and interesting. I think what I see, and I'd love to see if you have anything different, is that when it comes to survivors, healing is a complicated issue. It's time, it's resources, and then there's also people that will say, I'm in the sex trade, and it is consensual. And then there's others that will say, no, I was put in the sex trade and it was not consensual, it was coercive, it was against my will. One of the things that they're trying to do all over the world is to actually drive down demand. They're trying to actually make the message that you should never, ever, ever, never pay for sex. And so if that is the case, that real men don't pay for sex, that people don't pay for sex, then we can drive down the demand. The World Cup is just, it's gross what happens attached to any World Cup. The amount of children, youth, and adult women that are trafficked during the World Cup, it's foul. But because there's a demand. Someone's wanting to pay for sex during that time period. But I think in terms of rehabilitating the rings, there's no rehabilitation for this is organized crime at that point. They are very serious organized crime syndicates that are trafficking and moving people. For me, there's prosecution is the only but a John, someone paying for sex is potentially rehabilitated. They can be educated that this is an act, a violent act, a non-consensual act. This is not.
Well, and I think another question to ask too is, or something that affects an answer, I think, to your question is, whose outcome are we trying to get to? There's a societal outcome that says we do need to move forward with arresting these people, prosecuting them, locking them away, having some sort of negative outcome to this behavior that we're deeming as inappropriate, and that we've criminalized. But it's not going to always be that every victim is going to feel that way. We need much better information on them. It's sort of like a theme, right? We need better data. But so at my agency, we collect information about law enforcement agencies themselves, like what kinds of programs do they provide, what kinds of units do they have, specialized units for addressing certain types of offenses and whatnot. And this isn't specifically for human trafficking or even sex crimes at all. But we have evidence right now that if you are an agency that says that you have a victim service component within your organization, that victims are actually less likely to want to move forward with charges in their case. So we've got information on, like, if an arrest wasn't made, but it was cleared some other way, that the victim, one of those clearance mechanisms is the victim said they wouldn't cooperate anymore. That rate is higher of victim non-cooperation within agencies that said they had a victim service provider within the agency. And it's really, there's probably a lot there that we haven't teased out. Is it that your victim service provision is really terrible and you scared the heck out of your victim? Or is it that part of what victims really want is a place to be understood? And I mean, I'm being a little naive about it, and I think you can speak to this far more than I can, sitting as a statistician, here and not on the front lines. But I wonder how much of that sort of one-on-one human piece is affecting their willingness to move forward with the prosecution. They have someone who hears them, and
Is the
right,
victim's goal to get a prosecution, or is the victim's goal for it to stop and to be heard?
right,
And if it's for the behavior to stop and to be heard, just filing a police report often meets their needs. It's our society's goal to perhaps prosecute. But prosecution rates is not something victims really care about. They just want to be safe tonight. So
Right.
it may be that they got their needs met,
right,
felt heard, the behavior stopped, and then, but if you had a police department that didn't have a victim services unit, there was no place for that victim to get heard,
right.
and there's only one path, which is prosecution. So it's hard, it would be fascinating to tease that out.
Yeah, it would be, hopefully someday we're going to get there. That's the goal. Because it is an amazing connection that was very unexpected.
And that's why our,
yeah.
that's why our enhanced collaborative model task forces are required to be partnerships between law enforcement and victim service providers, so that if the agency itself doesn't have a victim service person coordinator, they can go to the victim service provider and get that assistance, and it's always available. And they collaborate on how to deal with different victims, because each victim is different. And they can then make a unified decision with the victim on how do we move forward.
Any other questions or comments?
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for, we lost that for August, but that's okay.
That's okay.
We're supposed to
It was
end at
time, yes.
We've got some,
Oh,
if
we
anyone
were-
wants extra